The North African desert had always been a place of extremes, scorching sun, shifting sands, and a war that seemed as endless as the horizon. For years, the Afrika Korps, led by Field Marshal Rommel, had carved a reputation for audacity, striking deep into British lines and evading capture with a mix of daring and discipline. Yet by early 1943, the tide was turning. Supply lines were stretched thin across hundreds of miles of hostile desert, and the once feared German army was beginning to feel the strain. Rommel, the desert fox, was forced to step back from the front due to illness. His departure left a vacuum of command at a moment when every decision could mean life or death for thousands of men. Into this breach stepped Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, a man from a long Prussian military dynasty, known for his precision and calm under pressure. At 54, he was experienced, disciplined, and determined, yet he inherited a situation that was nearly impossible to save. The men of the Afrika Korps and their Italian allies were exhausted, their morale fraying after months of retreat and skirmishes. Their tanks were dwindling, their aircraft mostly destroyed or grounded, and the supply columns that had once fed their forces were intercepted or lost to the unforgiving desert. Every day brought new challenges: heat that burned through uniforms, sandstorms that blinded the eye, and the constant pressure of British forces tightening around them. Von Arnim walked through the encampments, seeing not the formidable soldiers he expected, but men who looked older than their years, their faces etched with fatigue and anxiety. The British, under General Montgomery, had learned from every previous engagement. They studied the Afrika Korps' tactics, anticipating movements and cutting off supply routes with methodical precision. It was a strategy that no army had successfully executed on such a scale before in the desert. Von Arnim watched as his maps filled with red markings, showing blocked routes, positions overrun, and forces surrounded. It was a nightmare of strategy coming to life, and he knew that time was slipping away with every passing hour. Orders came and went, but many could not be executed. Communications were faltering, and the men were forced to improvise in ways that undermined the very efficiency that Prussian military tradition prized. The desert had become a cage. Even the Italian units, loyal and courageous, could not stem the inevitable collapse. Rumors of desertion, fatigue, and fear rippled through the ranks, carried on whispers between soldiers who dared not speak too loudly, for the desert seemed to listen and judge. Von Arnim knew that the coming days would define not just his career, but the fate of tens of thousands of men. Every decision was weighted with the knowledge that failure meant more than defeat. It meant the destruction of an entire army in a theater where survival already seemed miraculous. Von Arnim walked among his officers, discussing contingency plans that he hoped would delay the inevitable, buying time in a desert that was merciless and indifferent to human struggle. The men themselves clung to routine where they could find it. They maintained weapons that had seen too much battle, repaired vehicles with whatever materials remained, and trained under a sun that scorched their very determination. Yet the reality was clear. The British were closing in, and the Afrika Korps was no longer the hunter, it had become the prey. Even as von Arnim tried to marshal his experience and authority, the psychological weight of encirclement, supply shortages, and the shadow of Stalingrad hung over him. Every soldier could sense it, the creeping inevitability of surrender that seemed unthinkable for men who had been raised to fight to the last. Amidst all this, von Arnim made one crucial observation. The British were not merely using force, they were applying strategy, innovation, and patience. The desert, once an equalizer, was now a partner to the enemy, amplifying their advantage. For the first time, he realized that the Afrika Korps' legendary mobility and cunning could not outmatch the precision and coordination of a well-prepared opponent. History had put him in a corner, and he understood that the coming weeks would test everything he had learned in decades of service. And so, as the sun sank low over the endless dunes, von Arnim prepared his men for a fight unlike any they had faced. It was a struggle not only against the British forces, but against the merciless desert and the relentless passage of time. Every decision mattered, every delay carried consequence, and the shadow of what was to come loomed over the vast, burning sands. The stage was set, the players weary but determined, and the North African theater was about to witness a moment that no soldier, commander, or historian would soon forget.
The British had been patient, watching, learning, waiting for the moment to strike. They had observed the movements of the Afrika Korps for months, noting patterns in supply convoys, patrols, and defensive positions. Every skirmish, every retreat, every desperate counterattack was analyzed. General Montgomery had no intention of repeating the mistakes of past campaigns. This time, the British aimed not merely to push the enemy back, but to encircle them completely, to trap an entire army in the desert and cut off any hope of escape. Von Arnim knew the danger was coming, but the speed and precision of the British advance still took him by surprise. Reports came in from scouts and signals intelligence that indicated supply lines had been severed in multiple directions. The desert, once a wide-open battlefield, now seemed like a cage, with escape routes shrinking by the day. Italian and German troops, weary and hungry, were forced to march in the blistering heat toward positions that offered no advantage. Tanks and trucks sputtered across sand-choked roads, engines failing, tires bursting, fuel dwindling. The British strategy was a combination of timing, deception, and relentless pressure. They struck at weak points, forcing Axis units to abandon positions that had been fortified for months. Each retreat brought the enemy closer to entrapment. Von Arnim attempted to counter with limited reserves, but every move was anticipated. British artillery rained down from positions beyond the horizon, and their air forces, though fewer in number than in Europe, struck with surgical precision. The Afrika Korps, once so mobile and feared, found itself reacting rather than dictating the pace of battle. Every day, von Arnim received reports of isolated units being cut off or destroyed. Small detachments of German and Italian soldiers were surrounded and forced to surrender, their radios silent after brief, desperate communications. Morale began to crumble. Men whispered about the fate of Stalingrad, about the stories of entire armies disappearing under encirclement. In these whispers was a growing fear that the British were attempting something unprecedented, something that would change the course of the war in North Africa. Yet the British did not rely solely on force. Deception was an essential element of their campaign. Dummy tanks, fake radio signals, and feigned retreats misled Axis commanders into committing troops to positions that had been fortified for months. Von Arnim began to notice inconsistencies, supply columns appearing where none should exist, reconnaissance reports that seemed too coincidental, movements of British forces that defied expectation. The Desert Fox's legendary cunning had been replaced by a methodical, almost clinical strategy that left little room for improvisation. Von Arnim moved constantly between forward posts and command centers, trying to coordinate defenses and rally his men. He inspected tank crews, infantry lines, and artillery positions, speaking to soldiers who looked at him with a mix of respect and despair. He knew that every choice carried immense weight. Every decision had the potential to save lives or cost them. The desert amplified mistakes, turning misjudgments into disasters. A single miscalculation could leave thousands stranded without water, food, or ammunition, vulnerable to the relentless British advance. The British pressed harder, closing gaps with precision. By mid-campaign, entire Axis formations were surrounded on three sides, leaving only narrow corridors that could not sustain supply or retreat. Von Arnim realized the magnitude of what was happening. No army had ever been trapped so comprehensively in the desert before. The British were demonstrating not just superior numbers or firepower, but mastery of logistics, intelligence, and timing. Every signal intercepted, every route blocked, every supply depot captured, added to the growing sense of inevitability. In these desperate days, soldiers endured unimaginable conditions. Heat blurred vision, sand clogged machinery, and rationed water ran out too quickly. Men scavenged abandoned equipment, repaired broken vehicles with ingenuity born of necessity, and pushed themselves beyond exhaustion. Yet even as exhaustion mounted, the encirclement tightened. British forces moved methodically, securing ridges and roadways, cutting off escape, and maintaining pressure without overextending. The Axis Corps was shrinking not just in numbers, but in hope. Von Arnim's leadership was tested as never before. He organized counterattacks, attempted to consolidate scattered units, and tried to negotiate movements that could delay the inevitable. Yet each day, the British lines grew stronger, and Axis positions became more precarious. He watched columns of exhausted men trudging across sand under the blazing sun, and he understood that survival alone was becoming impossible. The British had achieved something no army had before in this theater. They had transformed the desert itself into a weapon, using its vastness to trap and control, turning mobility into captivity. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dunes, the desert was no longer a place of opportunity for the Afrika Korps. It had become a theater of inevitability, a stage where strategy, patience, and relentless execution dictated the outcome. Von Arnim stood on a ridge, observing the tightening noose around his forces, knowing that what came next would define not only his command, but the fate of every man who had fought under him. The British had done something that would be remembered for decades, a methodical encirclement that forced even the most disciplined army to face its limits, testing courage, endurance, and leadership against an unforgiving desert and an unyielding enemy.
The morning air in the North African desert was heavy with tension, a quiet that carried the weight of countless exhausted men. Supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. Water rationing was strict, ammunition was all but gone, and the few remaining vehicles groaned across sand-choked tracks. Von Arnim walked among the men, noting their gaunt faces, the dust clinging to their uniforms, the silent conversations in broken Italian and German. This was no longer a battlefield. It had become a theater of desperation, where every movement was measured, every choice critical. For months, the Afrika Korps had been on the move, striking and retreating, evading capture with the skill of veterans who knew the desert better than any textbook could teach. But now, encirclement was complete. The British had blocked every route north, west, and east. To the south lay endless sand, scorching heat, and the creeping knowledge that nowhere was safe. The men understood that the encirclement was total. They whispered about supplies that never arrived, about comrades who had vanished in the night, about Stalingrad and what it had meant for those who surrendered. The first steps toward surrender were cautious. Von Arnim sent his chief of staff, Colonel Nolte, under a white flag to contact the British lines, a decision that carried immense risk. Nolte would carry the lives of tens of thousands in his hands. As he moved across the desert, he passed columns of exhausted men, tanks abandoned mid-journey, and artillery pieces spiked and useless. Soldiers watched silently, knowing that every step forward could signal the end of their struggle. Each man understood that surrender was not just a personal choice, it was the fate of entire units. Meanwhile, the British tightened their grip. Montgomery's forces were precise and disciplined, not a single route overlooked. Observation posts tracked every movement. Artillery emplantments controlled roads and ridges, denying the Afrika Korps the chance to regroup or escape. Aircraft flew overhead, not always to attack, but to confirm positions, disrupt supply efforts, and maintain constant pressure. The desert itself became a trap, amplifying the isolation of the Axis forces and magnifying the psychological weight of encirclement. The messages coming from the front lines painted a bleak picture. Ammunition was gone, rifles and machine guns destroyed to prevent capture, and vehicles stripped or sabotaged. Soldiers reported that even basic rations were unavailable. Morale, always fragile in the unforgiving desert, was collapsing under the strain of hunger, heat, and relentless pressure. Desertion became more common, and whispers of surrender spread like wildfire. Von Arnim understood the historical significance of what was happening. This would be the largest Axis surrender since Stalingrad, an entire army group forced to lay down arms. Negotiations moved forward cautiously. Colonel Nolte returned under the white flag with British officers, carrying proposals that would preserve the dignity of soldiers while ensuring that surrender was total and irrevocable. Von Arnim, aware of the propaganda that painted surrender as the ultimate humiliation, wrestled with the decision. Every choice he made had consequences for the lives of men who trusted him to lead them, even in the face of certain defeat. Yet he also knew that prolonging resistance would result in unnecessary deaths, leaving the men to perish in the desert under conditions that were already deadly enough. The formal surrender began slowly. Units were instructed to destroy what remained of their equipment to prevent its use by the enemy. Soldiers followed orders methodically, even in despair, dismantling artillery pieces, spiking tanks, and breaking weapons. The final signals from the Afrika Korps carried a quiet poetry in their finality. Ammunition shot off, arms and equipment destroyed, cannot fight no more. These words, transmitted with the calm precision of soldiers who understood the gravity of the situation, marked the end of months of relentless struggle and the culmination of strategic encirclement. The surrender was unlike anything von Arnim or his men had ever experienced. Tens of thousands of German and Italian soldiers, once feared across the desert, now stood in lines, their weapons gone, their movements restricted, waiting for the British to process them. There was no drama, no last-minute charge or desperate breakout. The desert, the British, and the weight of circumstance had removed that option. What remained was the stark reality of surrender, a moment of historical significance that few had witnessed in such scale before. The British managed the surrender with efficiency, ensuring that order was maintained and that chaos did not spread. Soldiers were segregated, accounted for, and prepared for transport to prisoner of war facilities. The psychological burden was immense. Men who had been trained to fight to the last bullet, who had been raised to uphold the pride of their armies, now faced a future where survival would depend on cooperation and patience. Many struggled to reconcile the reality of surrender with the teachings of their youth, the propaganda that had shaped their understanding of honor, and the harsh lessons of the desert. As the sun set over the vast dunes, von Arnim reflected on the sequence of events that had brought them here. The encirclement, the precision of British planning, the exhaustion of his troops, and the desert itself had combined to create a situation that no commander could have easily reversed. Yet amidst the despair, there was clarity. The surrender had preserved countless lives. It had prevented further bloodshed, and it had demonstrated in stark terms the power of strategy over mere force, preparation over improvisation, patience over recklessness. The soldiers of the Afrika Korps filed into British control, some with tears in their eyes, some with stoic faces, each carrying memories of battles fought and comrades lost. Von Arnim, for his part, accepted the inevitability with the dignity he could muster. He understood that history would judge the surrender not as a failure, but as a testament to leadership in impossible circumstances. The desert, which had once been the stage of mobility and cunning, had become the witness to the largest Axis capitulation in the region. The echoes of this surrender would be felt across the Mediterranean and remembered by historians, soldiers, and civilians alike for generations.
The desert had a way of stripping everything down to its essentials. There was no room for illusion, no hiding behind bravado or strategy. Von Arnim felt it with every step across the dunes, the heat pressing down, the dust clinging to his uniform, the silence of men who had walked too long and fought too hard. Leadership, he realized, was no longer about tactics or maneuvers. It was about decisions that could save lives or condemn them. Every order carried a weight heavier than any artillery shell, heavier than any desert sun. He walked among the remnants of his forces, observing the weary faces of soldiers who had survived months of combat. Their eyes reflected exhaustion, fear, and a dawning understanding that their fate was no longer in their hands. Von Arnim knew they looked to him not just for commands, but for reassurance, for some flicker of hope amid the inevitability of surrender. Yet he could not offer illusions. He could only act with honesty, integrity, and the cool discipline that had defined his career. The propaganda that had followed them through every campaign was relentless. German soldiers had been taught that surrender to the British meant humiliation, betrayal, a loss of honor. They had been raised to fight to the last man, to hold their positions until annihilation. Von Arnim understood this. He knew that his decision to negotiate surrender would be judged harshly by some, even as it preserved thousands of lives. Every commander in history had faced difficult choices, but few had faced the complete collapse of an army under circumstances so unforgiving. He reflected on the months of campaigning, the long marches across sand-choked roads, the constant threat of air attack, the diminishing supplies, the endless tactical calculations that had begun to unravel as the British encirclement tightened. Each battle left scars on both the terrain and the men who fought upon it. He remembered Rommel, the desert fox, and how illness had forced him to step back, leaving von Arnim with a command he neither sought nor could fully save. The weight of responsibility pressed down, as tangible as the desert heat. Decision after decision required balancing duty with survival. Orders to preserve remaining equipment, to organize retreating units, to maintain morale, were complicated by the reality that little could be done to change the outcome. He witnessed the slow disintegration of units that had once moved with precision and confidence. Artillery crews abandoned their pieces, tank columns faltered in sand, and the men carried the psychological weight of knowing escape was no longer possible. Leadership became a matter of guiding men through the inevitability of defeat, not inspiring victory. Von Arnim also understood the irony of the situation. For decades, he had been trained to achieve results through discipline, planning, and authority. Now, those same qualities could only manage surrender in the most orderly way possible. His role was no longer that of a conqueror or a tactician. It was that of a custodian of human life, preserving dignity and preventing unnecessary loss. He arranged for units to move in an organized fashion to British lines, ensuring that chaos did not overtake the weary soldiers. He supervised the destruction of remaining weapons and equipment, not out of military necessity alone, but to give men a sense of purpose and closure in a moment when purpose seemed to vanish. The psychological burden on the men was immense. Soldiers who had prided themselves on their toughness, who had survived months of desert warfare, now grappled with fear, uncertainty, and shame. Some hid their faces, some clenched their fists, some spoke in hushed tones of Stalingrad or the campaigns in Poland and France. Von Arnim moved among them, offering what guidance he could, listening to their concerns and acknowledging their suffering. He understood that his leadership in this moment was as much about empathy as strategy. He also reflected on the British forces themselves. Their patience, precision, and ability to coordinate such an extensive encirclement left an impression on him. No army had so effectively combined logistics, intelligence, and strategic positioning in the harshness of the desert. The surrender, while painful, was also a recognition of the ingenuity and discipline of the opponent. In a way, it reaffirmed his own understanding of war, not as a series of victories, but as a measure of endurance, judgment, and human resilience. Von Arnim's thoughts returned to the men who would soon cross into British custody. He considered their survival, their future as prisoners of war, and the long journey that lay ahead. Every soldier he commanded carried the weight of experience, training, and history, and it was his duty to ensure that those lives were preserved, even as the army itself ceased to function. He knew history would remember this moment, the largest Axis surrender in North Africa since Stalingrad, not just for its scale, but for the humanity it revealed amid disaster. As the desert sun set, casting long shadows over the dunes, von Arnim felt a mixture of relief and melancholy. Relief that the men would live, melancholy for the losses, the pride, and the campaign that had ended not in triumph, but in capitulation. Leadership, he realized, was not always about victory. Sometimes it was about guiding people through impossibility, finding order in chaos, and maintaining dignity when the world offered none. In that vast, burning desert, von Arnim had fulfilled that role to the best of his ability, preserving not just life, but a measure of honor in the face of history.
The desert fell silent after the surrender. The once thundering engines of tanks and artillery were gone, replaced by the soft shuffling of exhausted soldiers, their uniforms dust-streaked, their faces gaunt. The British had taken control, not with chaos, but with order, guiding tens of thousands of men into holding areas, organizing transport, and ensuring that the surrender was complete. Von Arnim watched from a distance, understanding that the desert had changed from a battlefield into a space of reckoning, where strategy, patience, and endurance had determined the outcome more than sheer force. For the soldiers, the reality of surrender was a mixture of relief and shame. Men who had fought tirelessly under the harsh sun, who had endured relentless attacks and grueling marches, now faced captivity. Their lives had been preserved, yet the psychological burden was immense. They were trained to fight, to resist, to embody the pride of the armies that raised them, and now they had to confront the fact that survival required compliance. Officers tried to maintain discipline among the ranks, yet whispers of despair and fear moved through the encampments like the desert wind. The treatment of prisoners by the British, while firm, was measured. Food, water, and shelter were provided, medical attention attended to the wounded, and order was enforced to prevent outbreaks of violence or chaos. Men who had faced death in battle now faced a different challenge: patience. Weeks would pass before they were transported to prisoner-of-war camps far from the desert, and during that time, the soldiers adjusted to the unfamiliar routines of captivity. The vastness of the desert faded behind them, replaced by fences, tents, and the rigid structures of POW life. The surrender had immense strategic consequences. The Axis forces were dealt a blow from which they would never recover in North Africa. Supply routes were severed, remaining troops scattered, and morale shattered. The Mediterranean theater shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. With the loss of so many men, equipment, and experienced commanders, the Axis could no longer mount effective operations in the region. British and Allied forces were now free to focus on the next stages of the war, using North Africa as a springboard for campaigns in Sicily, Italy, and beyond. Historians would later describe this moment as one of the most significant surrenders of the war. It was not just the scale, 275,000 men, but the manner in which it occurred. The British had executed a methodical, precise, and unprecedented encirclement. The desert itself had become a tool, shaping the outcome through geography, logistics, and timing. Von Arnim, despite the humiliation of surrender, recognized that history would remember the event not as a defeat in the personal sense, but as a demonstration of strategic mastery. The Axis Corps' surrender was a lesson in the limits of endurance, mobility, and even legendary tactical skill. Von Arnim reflected on the human dimension of it all. Every man who surrendered carried the weight of fear, fatigue, and uncertainty, yet also the spark of survival. Entire units that could have been annihilated had been preserved. Lives that might have been lost in futile resistance were saved through discipline, foresight, and difficult decision-making. It was a reminder that war was not merely about victory or defeat on the battlefield, but about leadership in moments of extreme adversity, about guiding people through impossible circumstances while maintaining a measure of humanity. The legacy of North Africa extended beyond the immediate surrender. The desert campaigns had tested every aspect of modern warfare: logistics over vast distances, the integration of air and ground forces, the impact of intelligence and code-breaking, and the importance of morale and psychological endurance. Lessons learned in this theater would influence commanders on both sides for the remainder of the war. The surrender of the Axis Corps became a case study in strategy, endurance, and the interplay between human limitations and military innovation. In the weeks that followed, the men began their journeys to POW camps. Some were sent to Italy, others to England or farther afield. Despite the hardships ahead, they carried with them stories of the desert, the ingenuity, the endurance, the camaraderie, and the fear. They had witnessed history not as distant observers, but as participants in a campaign that had tested the limits of human will. Von Arnim, traveling under supervision but with his reputation intact among the Allies, contemplated the irony of the situation. The desert, which had once provided opportunities for audacious triumphs, had now imposed one of the most complete strategic lessons of the war. The North African campaign left behind a landscape scarred by battle and memory. Abandoned tanks, destroyed equipment, and deserted positions became markers of human struggle and strategic brilliance. The British and Allied victory in the desert demonstrated that preparation, patience, and relentless application of strategy could achieve results that raw bravery alone could not. The surrender of von Arnim's forces would be remembered as a turning point, a moment when human ingenuity and discipline reshaped the course of history in a theater that had seemed as untamable as the desert itself. In the end, the story of the Axis Corps was not simply one of defeat. It was a story of leadership under impossible circumstances, of endurance in the face of overwhelming odds, and the complex interplay between strategy, geography, and human will. The men survived, the armies surrendered, and history took note. Von Arnim's decision, measured and deliberate, preserved life and demonstrated that even in the face of inevitable defeat, leadership and humanity could leave a lasting mark on the story of war. The desert, once a place of endless pursuit, had witnessed the largest Axis surrender in North Africa and had taught a lesson that would echo through generations.